Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. Recognize the Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for leave for an extended introduction.
Minister has asked leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, in the West Gallery today, I have 3 students from the Paul J. Hill School of Business: Brett Zimmer, Cole Zawazlak, and Nicole Sopik, along with Graham Purse, who teaches Business 340. The Hill Business School, Mr. Speaker, will be hosting the 15th anniversary 2020 JDC West competition here in Regina at the U of R. I'd also like to congratulate their intercollegiate business competition team, who had 3 of 4 teams advance to the final round of competition in Kingston, Ontario. The Hill School, as we know, hosts the RBC Women in Executive in Residence, but also the Rawlinson Executive in Residence in Indigenous Entrepreneurship. They also are very good at giving back. Many of us will be familiar with 5 Days for the Homeless. The economic impact of this school to our economy is estimated at $211 million, Mr. Speaker. I'd like all members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to join with the Minister on behalf of the official opposition, welcoming these students and teachers to their Legislative Assembly. Certainly the JDC West competition, no pressure, but the Hill School's generally done quite well for Regina and the University of Regina in the competition, so we'll be looking with great interest to see how it all works out, but wishing them all the best and continued success in the work that they do contribute to our post-secondary education sector and to our economy and to Saskatchewan as a whole. So again, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join with the Minister in welcoming these very important people to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you to this Assembly, I'd like to introduce a guest in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, Tristan Banier. Tristan is with Diabetes Canada. The Minister of Rural and Remote Health and myself had an opportunity this morning to meet with him along with Joan King. The Diabetes Canada folks are in the building today. They're hosting an MLA reception later on this afternoon for members on both sides of the House. We're looking forward to that, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank them for all their advocacy work and ask all members to please give Tristan a warm welcome to his Assembly. And Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, I'd also like to introduce a guest in the West Gallery. Mr. Speaker, Cole Zawazlak is a longtime friend of my communications ministerial assistant and an assistant golf pro at the Royal Regina, Mr. Speaker, so we're hopeful that he can help the Minister of Social Services. Mr. Speaker, he's currently finishing up a finance degree at the University of Regina, and I understand he's a big fan of Question Period, and so I'd ask all members to please give him a warm welcome to his Legislative Assembly.
As a member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister in welcoming our guests here today from Diabetes Canada. Myself and the member from Saskatoon Centre had the opportunity to meet with them this morning, and I'd like to welcome them to your gallery, Mr. Speaker. And I know that we look forward to the evening this evening and the reception. And thank you for all the work that you do. I think we had a very informative meeting, and I continue to look forward to your advocacy on behalf of those who are living with diabetes in this province and in Canada. Thank you very much.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Saskatchewan, Willow Grove, and I will get up and we'll speak in stereo. Mr. Speaker, I would like to join with the member opposite in welcoming Tom Graham and these people to the Assembly today. We thank them for the work that they do representing workers in our province and regard them as colleagues and friends.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join the minister in welcoming the folks from CUPE here. They're friends of working people in Saskatchewan and no strangers to the legislature because they're championing the causes of working people here in Saskatchewan. Of course, we introduced Tom Graham, the president of CUPE Saskatchewan, and beside him is Tria Donaldson. And then over on this side over here, we have Jackie Christensen, who's chair of the Education Workers. Kathy, if you could give a wave, you're kind of hidden behind there. And also Marie Moore. And I'm not sure if Deborah Gamaldi is in the building. Is she? I don't know, but she might be here. Anyways, I ask all members to give these folks a warm welcome. I know they've been meeting with people this morning on a very important issue. We'll hear more about that later. Thanks so much.
Recognize the Minister for Central Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to introduce today, seated in the West Gallery, a visitor that comes to us from Toronto, Ms. Christina Cunningham. Christina has a keen interest in speaking to her. She's interested in the democratic process, certainly, and she thinks that our legislative building is one of the most beautiful in the country, and we certainly agree with her. Christina is a Canadian Director of Public Affairs at Vertex Pharmaceuticals, which produces a unique suite of drug treatments for cystic fibrosis, or CF. At lunchtime today, Christine hosted an MLA reception where members on both sides of the House had an opportunity to hear a presentation on some of the new developments in the area of CF. According to the latest count by Cystic Fibrosis Canada, there are more than 4,300 Canadians who have been diagnosed with CF, and of that number, 124 Saskatchewan residents live with cystic fibrosis. So we are delighted with the considerable progress that is being made in this area of new treatments. Again, we welcome Christine and her colleagues to Saskatchewan and to the Saskatchewan Legislative Assembly. I ask all colleagues to help me welcome her here. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to join with the minister in welcoming the group from Vertex Pharmaceuticals here to the legislature. Is pleased to participate in that luncheon as well. And we know that they're doing very good work in researching the treatments that are available for people suffering with cystic fibrosis. So I'd ask all members to join with me in welcoming them to their legislative assembly. And, Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, I would also like to just give a nod to Graham Pearce, who is noted as being an instructor at the Hill School of Business. Had the I guess, pleasure of working with Graham. Several years ago, he was a colleague at the law firm Miller Thompson, and a bright legal mind, not just in matters of law, but in matters of tax. So I'd like to ask all members to join with me in welcoming Graham to his Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, it's my pleasure to introduce a colleague and a dedicated public servant in the House today. Seated in your gallery is the Provincial Capital Commission CEO, Monique Gonifet-Miller. Monique has been with the Provincial Capital Commission since 2017 and has dedicated much of her professional life to preserving, promoting and sharing heritage content with Canadian citizens. In addition to her time with the PCC, prior to being named CEO, Monique spent time with the RCMP Heritage Centre as well as the British Columbia Government House. Her expertise in both tourism and government is already benefiting the PCC, and I am pleased to have the opportunity to work with her in my role for the betterment of the province. I'd like to thank Monique for her continued efforts in her role as PCC CEO, and I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming her to her assembly today.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister in welcoming Monique to her Legislative Assembly. Since she's moved to Saskatchewan just a few years ago, she's really taken this province and this city by storm, as you've heard already from the Minister's remarks on the many very prominent roles she's had. It's great to see her in this new role, somewhat new role now as CEO of the PCC. It's always a pleasure to see her in her Legislative Assembly, and I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming her today.
You're here.
And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, because I don't think he's been introduced quite enough times yet, I'd like to recognize a friend of mine, Graham Purse, who's seated right behind me. He is a member of the Regina Bar, a great lawyer, and it's a wonderful pleasure to see him here today to watch the legislative proceedings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You're here.
As a member for John Rochdale.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister responsible for the Provincial Capital Commission to also acknowledge Monique seated in your gallery. Monique has really embraced her role as the CEO of the PCC, and I know just the plans and the dedication that she has for advancing the PCC to not just within the city of Regina, but to the province as a whole. We really appreciate her dedication and her enthusiasm, and we will be very well served by Monique's passionate interest in Regina. So thank you very much. Welcoming Monique to her Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Noting that we are giving multiple introductions today, I thought I would rise as well and enter into these important introductions. I want to also welcome Monique to her Legislative Assembly. I think it was about 3 years ago. I thought it was 2, but it's actually been 3 years ago that she was first introduced in this Assembly. One of the first things that she did when she came to this city was to contact me as her MLA, and I know she's just been a really important supporter of women in politics, both in British Columbia and here in Saskatchewan, and really right across the country. And certainly your coming to Saskatchewan with Dean and Corbin has enriched all of us. I hope, I know that you appreciate being here as well. So I'd like all members to join with me to welcome her to her Legislative Assembly. And also, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to welcome our friends from CUPE to their Legislative Assembly today. I see Deborah Grimaldi has joined us here today. Deborah is the Regional Director for CUPE in the Regina office, or the provincial right across the province. We have also Tom Graham, President of CUPE Saskatchewan and TRIA, as well as Jackie and Marie, who are in the West Gallery. Mr. Speaker, I invite all members to join me in welcoming these important guests to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and all members of the Legislative Assembly, I would like to welcome in the West Gallery 32 grade 10 students from Melville Comprehensive School, home of the Melville Cobras. They are accompanied by their teacher, Andy Rondo, who is very supportive in bringing students to the Legislative Assembly, who in his spare time is also a Melville City Councillor, and Vice Principal Darren Wandy, who is a passionate advocate for junior baseball in Melville and is a key organizer in the highly successful Parkland Outdoor Show and Expo. I am looking forward to their engaging discussions, and I would like all members to welcome the Melville Comprehensive students and their teachers to their Legislative Assembly. Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to join in briefly with this welcome to the students and the teachers, the principal from Melville, but particularly on behalf of the official opposition in my capacity as critic for municipal affairs. It's an honour to welcome Andy Rondeau to his assembly, city councillor in Melville, an exceptional teacher. It's a pleasure to have him and his students in the assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions. Oh, recognize the member from Batoche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from the citizens who are opposed, strongly opposed, to the federal government's decision to impose an unfair and ineffective carbon tax in the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of Dalmany. I do so present. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens, businesses, communities from all across Saskatchewan as it relates to the Sask Party government's choice to impose the PST onto construction labour. Of course, they also expanded the PST and hiked it to 6%, accounting to the tune of $1 billion tax hike for Saskatchewan people. I know for Saskatchewan households, it's hit them hard, with the average household now paying $800 more per year in PST than they were just 4 years ago. Of course, that hurts our economy. And as it relates to the Sask Party's imposition of this tax onto construction labour, well, quite simply, it's the epitome of a job-killing tax. Sadly, permits are down all across Saskatchewan. Projects that are important have been shelved. Thousands of hardworking tradespeople have lost their jobs. So many of them have had to leave the province in pursuit of employment, a loss for them and their family, certainly a loss for us as a province. The prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. The petitions today are signed by concerned residents of Regina. I so submit.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Melville Saltcoats.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know that the best agreements are those reached at the bargaining table. So I want to congratulate Teamsters Canada and the Canadian National Railway for reaching a tentative agreement this morning. It is unfortunate that this strike has affected so many industries and livelihoods across the country, and the impact has been felt here at home in Saskatchewan and most certainly in my constituency of Melville Saltcoats. Mr. Speaker, with all of the challenges a country faces with moving our commodities to market, a rail strike was the last situation that anyone wanted to see. Even without job actions like this, we've seen our railway struggle to keep up to our province's growing economy as we attempt to feed and fuel the world. But I know over 3,000 people will be glad to get back to their jobs and be working hard to clear the backlog that was created, Mr. Speaker. The world needs more of Saskatchewan, and this is one of the major arteries that helps ensure food security and energy security as well. So once again, I'd like to say thank you to the Canadian National Railway and Teamsters for getting this resolved and getting an agreement signed. And to all groups and organizations that advocated and supported getting this situation resolved quickly, we thank you.
Recognise the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On July 12th, a very special space was officially opened at the Mental Health Unit at Victoria Hospital in Prince Albert. The space is called Angela's Corner and is designed to provide rest and reading material for the hundreds of children and youth who are admitted to the mental health unit each year. This space is named after Angela Morrison, who lost her battle with depression in March of 2018. Angela's parents, Sheldon and Shannon, wanted to honour her memory and cut the ribbon for the official opening surrounded by family and friends. Mr. Speaker, the space is filled with tributes to Angela and include her graduation photo, a mural created by a local artist, and many shelves of donated books. Angela's parents hope that this space will help young people who are struggling with mental health problems and want this space to be a quiet refuge for the young people in need. Mr. Speaker, while this space is a beautiful tribute to Angela, we know we are losing our young people too often. We know a suicide prevention strategy is an important first step in better supporting Saskatchewan children and youth who are giving up hope. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members join with me in remembering Angela Morrison and in thanking her family and friends for creating Angela's Corner at the Mental Health Unit of Prince Albert's Victoria Hospital. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, November 18th, the Saskatchewan Rivers Public Board of Education and the Saskatchewan Rivers Students for Change received the 2019 Premier's Board of Education Award for Innovation and Excellence in Education. The Premier's Award recognized educational innovations and improvements focused on student achievement that have been advanced or directed by school boards. This is also a significant award, as this year marked the 20th anniversary of the award. The Group 1 award for their submission of Empowering Students and Responding to Student Voice, a student-led pathway to improve student outcomes. In its application for the award, Saskatchewan Rivers said its board, along with a team of students, implemented a division-wide council known as the Saskatchewan Rivers Student for Change. This council, made up of student trustees, discusses challenges and opportunities. They take part in leadership and learning, plans actions and events, and advocates for student learning and well-being. Mr. Speaker, the Council is a valuable tool as they provide advice and perspective directly to the Board. This important student involvement provides an opportunity to lead change and positively affect student achievements and outcomes. I ask all members to join me in congratulating the Saskatchewan Rivers Public School Board and Students for Change trustees on being recognized and awarded for their innovative and inclusive approach to education. Thank you.
There's a member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Indigenous Christian Fellowship has been a force for good in Regina's inner city for over 40 years now. During my time in office, I've had the privilege to work closely with ICF Director Bert Adama and his dedicated staff and volunteers, so I'm well aware of the wonderful work they do ministering to the physical and spiritual needs of some of Regina's most disadvantaged citizens. It's important work largely funded by organizations, businesses, and churches who recognize that healthy individuals and families are the fundamental building blocks of healthy communities. Earlier this fall, I and the member for Regina Northeast attended the ICF's annual fundraiser. It was a wonderful evening with over 300 folks attending. Over 24 sponsors purchased tables, so attendance at the event was free. There were even more contributors to the silent auction. A big thank you to all of them, as well as to the gala organizers Peter Braun, Diane Campo, Kathleen DeWold, and Gail Fry. The entertainment throughout the evening was excellent as well and featured Jibikwe Campo drumming and singing, Meadow Musqua dancing, and Jennifer Jade Kerr singing, though not all at the same time, Mr. Speaker. The heart of the event were the folks who spoke to the evening's theme of hurt, healing, and hope, and the positive influence that ICF has had in their lives. I think of, in particular, Beatrice Wallace and Jason Whitecap. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge Don List of Birdsong Communications, MC Extraordinaire Lyle Daniels, and Elder May Denemy for their contributions to the evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
There's a member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this evening the members will have the pleasure of joining Diabetes Canada for a reception here at the Legislature. It will be an opportunity to hear from their leadership, staff and volunteers and express our appreciation for their contributions. Diabetes Canada continues to play an important role in research, advocacy and awareness efforts both nationally and here in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, as you know, diabetes can have a significant impact on the individual and their family. That's why education, early diagnosis, and treatment are so important in preventing or managing this condition. During the noon hour, Diabetes Canada organized a risk assessment for type 2 diabetes for MLAs here at the Legislature, and I was pleased to participate. Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes that diabetes is a serious condition that affects many people in our province. We continue to support those affected by providing services, medication, devices, and supplies. Working in partnership with other agencies and organizations like Diabetes Canada is very important, and we appreciate the work that they do to help people with diabetes live longer, better, healthier lives. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in thanking the Diabetes Canada leadership, staff, and volunteers for their service to Saskatchewan people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Cut Knife Turtleford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Each year, the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, more commonly known as PNWAR, recognizes a person who has gone above and beyond to build trust and cooperation across the U.S.-Canada border. In honor of PNWAR's founder, this recognition comes in the form of the Alan Luschel Memorial Award. Mr. Speaker, at this year's PNWAR Summit in Saskatoon, the Premier and myself presented the award to our very own, the member from Lumsden Morris.
Hear, hear.
I'd like to read a quote from the PNWAR Daily News at the summit, and it reads as follows. Lyle Stewart was honoured with this award for his exceptional service to both Canada and the United States during his service as Saskatchewan's first president of PNWAR, as well as his 2 years as vice president, end quote. Mr. Speaker, during the member's time as president, he advocated and facilitated trade, investment, and cooperation between the economies of northwestern North America. In addition to energy and mining, the member ensured that agriculture was at the forefront of PNWAR's agenda by addressing red tape, promoting agricultural exports, and fighting for issues like electronic certification for livestock. He also addressed top environmental concerns like invasive aquatic species such as quagga and zebra mussels. As past president of PNWAR, I'm incredibly honoured to be following in the footsteps of such a great leader. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members of this Assembly join me in congratulating the member from Lumsden Morris on this incredible achievement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Patosh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On September 28th, the town of Pilger in my constituency grew from a population of 26 to well over 400. Mr. Speaker, people came from all over the province to the 15th annual Pilger Pumpkin Festival. The festival honors all things pumpkin, including pumpkin pies, decorations, and the biggest and best of all, the pumpkin growing competition. Mr. Speaker, I was honored to once again be MC of the competition. The junior local honors went to Preston Hoppy with his 192-pound pumpkin, and the seniors' local prize went to Doreen Debrahutsky at 289-pound pumpkin. Mr. Speaker, while these are some big plants, they pale in comparison to the competition's king of all pumpkins, Colby Neufeld's 472-pound washing machine-size pumpkin. Mr. Speaker, in addition to pumpkin growing competition, the festival included bouncy castles, wagon rides, scavenger hunts, and much more. The day capped off with a breathtaking fireworks display. And as the saying goes, there may be frost on the pumpkin, but there was warmth in everyone's heart at the 15th annual Pilger Pumpkin Fest. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. Recognize the member for John Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, nearly half of Saskatchewan elementary students say that they've been physically assaulted in school at least once, the highest rate in the country. And today, a union representing education workers in our schools released the results of their survey, which shows just how violent their workplaces, our children's schools, have become. One education worker wrote in the survey, and I quote, "Violent behaviour from students seems to be increasing every year." Another said, "From my experience, the problem of violence is escalating. As well, there seems to be an increase in the behavioural issues of students and less support to manage those needs." End quote. This violence takes its toll on students and on educators and on parents who are concerned for their children's safety. This violence is a symptom of overcrowding and understaffing that we see in our classrooms, and it has gotten markedly worse as a result of this government's cuts to per-student funding. To the Premier, what are you doing to address this growing concern of violence in our children's schools?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the Attorney General and I had the great privilege of meeting with representatives this morning to talk about the recommendations and some of the information that has come out in their report, Mr. Speaker. That's the second time that I've met with the committee, Mr. Speaker, and I've indicated, and so as the Attorney General, that we're continuing to prepare to meet with them again, Mr. Speaker. The report is currently with the Minister of Education, with the Ministry of Education, and I know that the Attorney General's office is also looking at a number of the recommendations that have come forward in this report, Mr. Speaker. But I can't help but think, Mr. Speaker, and I made this comment this morning, that a lot of the work that's been done by this report, and we're very happy to receive it, Mr. Speaker, is inextricably linked to some of the composition issues that we have in our classroom, Mr. Speaker, and we are taking steps to address the issue of composition in our classroom, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. Mr. Speaker, and we've done that by creating a committee, Mr. Speaker, that's going to be looking directly at this issue. But we know, Mr. Speaker, that by dealing with issues in our classroom, Mr. Speaker, the composition issues in particular, Mr. Speaker, that's going to lead to a path forward, Mr. Speaker, where we can start to address a number of these issues. But in the meantime, the Ministry of Education and the Office of the Attorney General is looking quite closely at the recommendations and the material that was provided in the report, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for John Lakefield.
It's encouraging, Mr. Speaker, to hear that there might be some action taken on this, because this is an issue that needs our urgent attention. The CUPE Education Survey released found that 40% of education support workers experience violence in our schools daily, weekly, and monthly. And fully 70% of EAs have experienced violence at least once in the last 3 years. 70%, Mr. Speaker. 2/3 have said that they are somewhat or significantly concerned about their own mental health and safety in our schools, and 1 in 5 has lost time away from their job because of violence that they've experienced. Will the minister finally concede that with falling per-student funding in each of the last 3 years, his government's cuts are hurting students, they're hurting staff, and they're letting Saskatchewan people down? Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned on the floor of this Assembly more than once, Mr. Speaker, this government's commitment to public education, the largest education budget in the history of this province, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to look at the issues that are affecting our classrooms, Mr. Speaker, around composition, Mr. Speaker. Some of the numbers that have been provided to us in this report, Mr. Speaker, are very concerning, Mr. Speaker, and both the Attorney General and I acknowledged that this morning in our meeting. We've already acknowledged that we're going to continue to have conversations with the authors of the report, Mr. Speaker, not just with the authors of the report, Mr. Speaker, but our other partners in education, whether that's the SSBA or the STF, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that we address this very serious issue. But as I mentioned in my last answer, Mr. Speaker, this is inextricably linked to the composition issues in our classroom, which this government is taking active steps to address.
Here, here. As a member for John Lakefield.
Mr. Speaker, this issue is also inextricably linked to the lack of funding in our classrooms.
Here, here, here.
And as we've noted, we have Jackie Christensen and Marie Moore with us today from the Education Workers Steering Committee, and they have some questions for the ministers. They're calling for action from school divisions and the province, including for the government, to significantly increase operating funding, to allow for the hiring of additional EAs, and a letter of commitment from the provincial government affirming that it will work with stakeholders to reduce workplace violence in our schools. It's urgently needed, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier commit to this today?
Here, here. Here, here.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, we made representations this morning in our meeting, Mr. Speaker. We'll have more meetings with the committee, Mr. Speaker, as our ministries, our respective ministries between mine and the Ministry of the Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, analyze the recommendations that have been put forward, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I stand every day in this House listening to questions that come from the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, and she demands lots of things from this government. But the one thing we never hear from that member, Mr. Speaker, or anybody on that side of the House, is what their plan is. Mr. Speaker, we've developed a plan, we've developed a protocol, Mr. Speaker, to deal with some of the very serious issues in our classroom, Mr. Speaker, and all the member opposite does is stand up and say, just throw a whole bunch more money at it, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to do that without a plan. We're not going to do that without a plan to address the very serious issues that are in our classroom, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, as we move forward with the work of the committee, Mr. Speaker, we'll be considering all the options that are available to us, Mr. Speaker, and what the people of Saskatchewan can expect is action from this government.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday a memo went out to the staff of Regina Pioneer Village. It says wards in the facility continue to be closed each week because they're full of mold, and that to date 142 beds have been closed. It mentions that seniors continue to be shuffled around and may be located out of the community. Mr. Speaker, the deteriorating condition of this building has been known to this government for years. Their own assessment showed that as early as 2014, it was in critical condition and needed $60 million in repairs, yet they've sat on their hands. How did this government fail to plan for this? And where exactly will the seniors who are losing their homes be relocated?
You're here.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite stated, there's a serious mold issue at Regina Pioneer Village. We've known about this for quite some time. Remediation work has been underway for quite some time, Mr. Speaker. Repair work's being done. While part of the facility is closed, much of the facility is still open, Mr. Speaker. An RFP was issued by the Saskatchewan Health Authority some time ago, has closed now, Mr. Speaker. They're asking for proposals where we could look at affiliates or private sector or CBOs, Mr. Speaker, that might be interested in providing those services as we decide what we're going to do long term. Mr. Speaker, while that review work is being done, it's going to be compared to a traditional build within the system. Mr. Speaker, this is not any different than was been done for many years in long-term care, including under the members opposite, where you look at a mix of affiliates, of private, and of Saskatchewan Health Authority facilities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, since 2011, this government has closed 207 long-term care beds in the Regina area, despite the growing need. Seniors are being moved out of their home at Pioneer Village. Families using the hostel at Wascana Village have been displaced, and this government is just now starting the planning to mitigate an issue they should have addressed years ago. Again, to the minister, what is the plan to add desperately needed long-term care beds in Regina?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, the RFP issued by the Saskatchewan Health Authority called for the same number of beds as in Regina Pioneer Village, approximately 350 beds, I believe, Mr. Speaker. As they do the review work, compare that to whether we should go to an affiliate or to a CBO or to the private sector, Mr. Speaker. That'll be weighed against a traditional build as is operated right now. Mr. Speaker, in the meantime, to help alleviate some of the beds that have been closed, and again, I would reiterate, there's remediation work being done at Regina Pioneer Village to save some of the beds that are there, Mr. Speaker. While that work is being done, an RFP has also been issued for 100 beds to help alleviate some of that congestion. Mr. Speaker, we think that'll probably be awarded very soon. You'll be hearing something about it. Mr. Speaker, it's just simply not accurate to say nothing has been done. Mr. Speaker, the SHA has been working diligently on this.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just seniors and their families who are being hurt by this government's inaction. Yesterday, hundreds of Pioneer Village and Wascana Rehab employees were told their positions no longer exist. Christmas is around the corner. People in Saskatchewan are already having a hard time making ends meet, and now hundreds of people are left wondering where they'll get their next paycheck because this government failed to invest in long-term care. To the minister, what is this government's plan to ensure there are no permanent job losses as a result of the issues at Pioneer Village?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, approximately half the beds, roughly half the beds at Regina Pioneer Village have had to be closed right now because of the mold issue. Mr. Speaker, no staffing cuts have been made. At some point, Mr. Speaker, we need to reflect less beds in the facility. Mr. Speaker, we've been doing much of it through attrition. There's been a significant number of FTEs that have been reduced by attrition. Mr. Speaker, while the member says how many layoffs, as of now, Mr. Speaker, there's been none. Mr. Speaker, every effort has been made to do this through attrition. Mr. Speaker, what will be happening, the letters that were given to unions, this was to notify them under their collective bargaining agreements so discussions could start on what to do, how to handle appropriately the employees that will be affected. Mr. Speaker, officials at the SHA tell me that because there's a large number of employees working in this industry in Regina and Regina area, Mr. Speaker, that there is constant turnover. They believe that, if not all, most of these employees will be employed within the sector.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's pretty remarkable for the Minister of Health to suggest that there isn't a chill on raising concerns by public sector employees. We've seen the hush memo sent by the SHA to healthcare workers. The Public Interest Disclosure Commissioner has flagged concerns about the inadequacy of the public whistleblower process and the fact information comes to her in brown envelopes. Now the nurses' union says that their members reach out to them quite frequently about raising concerns. This is something that we have been hearing about for years. We are happy the minister is committed to making our requested legislative change, but more needs to be done to address this government's culture of fear. What's the minister's plan to ensure people feel safe coming forward?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Deputy Leader of the Opposition with her comments on ensuring that whistleblower protection is provided to Saskatchewan Health Authority employees. Mr. Speaker, it's never been in any way, shape or form the intent of this government to muzzle healthcare workers, doctors. It absolutely has not been, Mr. Speaker. So that's why this initial step was taken. To the member's specific question, though, Mr. Speaker, I also mentioned yesterday that justice officials are already now starting to work on a draft bill that we plan on introducing in the House next spring to ensure that all healthcare workers are afforded this protection, Mr. Speaker. They'll do a consultation phase, as is typically done, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the members will have an opportunity for input. Mr. Speaker, we want to assure healthcare workers in the province that there is no muzzling intended, and we want to clear up any perception of that.
Recognize the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday and now today, the minister said that neither he nor anyone in government are trying to muzzle doctors and frontline employees. It wasn't that long ago the former premier stood in the Assembly promising to protect Peter Bowden, a care aide in Saskatoon, only to have the premier's office leak his personal information, costing him his job. People have every reason to be concerned about coming forward, thanks to this government. Beyond legislative changes to the Act, what is this government's plan to better support whistleblowers raising concerns and to make sure they're safe if they want to go to the Public Interest Commissioner?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, by regulation, in the next few weeks, Saskatchewan Health Authority employees will be covered under the provincial whistleblower legislation, Mr. Speaker, but as I also mentioned, we're going to move forward with legislation to protect all healthcare employees. Mr. Speaker, I think that's the ideal time to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. We'll be drafting new legislation. It'll give justice officials an opportunity to make sure that everybody's covered. As I said, I think there would no doubt be a consultation phase. I think the members would be certainly have an opportunity to send their thoughts in and weigh in on what the legislation would look like. Mr. Speaker, again, I want to make it perfectly clear there's no attempt on this side of the House by government to muzzle frontline employees, to muzzle doctors, Mr. Speaker. We're going to legislate that.
As a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To begin with, it's great news that a tentative agreement has been reached between CN and rail workers. That's going to get Saskatchewan's agricultural products moving again. Mr. Speaker, according to an opinion piece in the Western Producer, the fact that the Sask Party government was, quote, unwilling to sign onto a letter penned by the Saskatchewan NDP calling for an early rebate paid out to farmers drying grain is telling enough. Instead of taking an opportunity to demonstrate bipartisan cooperation to the federal government on the issue, Moe politicized it, end quote. With an issue as important as quick relief for our struggling grain producers, why didn't the government sign on immediately?
Recognize the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have demonstrated very early in this process with the federal government that we are opposed to a carbon tax for all the people of Saskatchewan, including farmers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in fact, a year ago when the Premier and the Attorney General myself had an interview, a press conference in the radio room of this very building, Mr. Speaker, I specifically identified farmers who dry their grain, farmers who use independent haulers to haul their grain, and farmers who use the rail lines to transport their grains, all who would be paying the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. So I would say on this front, we were far ahead of the NDP.
Hear, hear.
There's a member for Regina Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, the minister's answer just pours gas on the fire and proves that the government would rather play politics than actually find solutions. Working productively with Ottawa, with whoever's in Ottawa, to get things done.
Order, please. Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Working productively with the people, with whoever is in Ottawa, to get things done for the people of this province is the Premier's job. The Leader of the Opposition's call for a rebate on the cost of grain drying was exactly that kind of proposal. Again, from the Western producer, quote, current tactics are not working for anyone, notably the farmers stuck paying high grain drying bills, end quote. This government keeps pointing fingers to distract from their failure. Why won't they get work? Why won't they get to work to get things done for the people of this province?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, this is certainly why we took the approach going back 2 years ago to put forward a Made in Saskatchewan plan that would see a carbon tax imposed on not a single citizen of this province, whether they were a farmer or not, Mr. Speaker, whether they were a farmer trying to dry their grain this winter, or whether they were a family trying to drive their kids to hockey, Mr. Speaker. A carbon tax in Saskatchewan, in our economy.
Order. Member for Athabasca, order. Recognize the minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we were talking grain drying a year ago. We were talking grain drying more than a year ago when we put forward the plan for Saskatchewan, a Made in Saskatchewan approach that would see a carbon tax imposed on not a single citizen of the province should the Government of Canada choose to accept Saskatchewan's plan, Mr. Speaker. I've had an opportunity to speak with the new Environment Minister just today, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to working with Minister Wilkinson on this very particular issue, as well as every other one that we share a common interest.
Hear, hear.
As a member for Regina Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, it's good news to hear that at least one minister on that side is working productively. But, Mr. Speaker, we know that the Premier is meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister today. Instead of just pointing fingers, we hope that the Premier will take a lesson from the Leader of the Opposition and work to find solutions on common ground. Will the Premier commit that he will raise the grain drying exemption today with the federal government?
Recognize the Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think anybody in this province needs to worry about this Premier of Saskatchewan raising what is in the interests of all Saskatchewans. At every single opportunity, whether it's with the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, or any minister of the Government of Canada, Mr. Speaker, this government, every single member on this side of the House, the Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, will stand up for the people of Saskatchewan, unlike the members opposite who, when it comes to supporting the government,
Just enter debate. No problem. Recognize the ministers. Finish up, please.
Mr. Speaker, I would say again that the government on this side of the House, we're going to stand up for the people of Saskatchewan, unlike the members opposite, when it comes an opportunity to support the federal government, Mr. Speaker, on the carbon tax or on certainly issues around pipeline. We know which side they stand on.
Hear, hear.
Recognize a member for Regina Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, the question was for the Premier. Will he commit to raising the grain drying exemption for the farmers in this province?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I will reiterate what I just said, Mr. Speaker. On the issue of the carbon tax, on the negative effect that the carbon tax has on the people of Saskatchewan, on the lives of people of Saskatchewan, on how people earn their income in this province, how they raise their families in this province, Mr. Speaker. I'm pretty confident the Premier will raise that issue, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the effect of a carbon tax, how it's a negative effect on our economy, Mr. Speaker, and how we know it actually won't reduce emissions in this province, Mr. Speaker. So I have no confidence, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier will raise this very important issue.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, Northerners have been forgotten by this government. The Sask Party promised to build an all-season road to Wollaston Lake more than 10 years ago. Winter is coming, but the ice road isn't ready yet, and the people have no road access while the lake freezes over. When will the Sask Party finally deliver on a promise for an all-season road to Wollaston Lake and Hatchet Lake Denny Nation?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, this government takes northern infrastructure issues very seriously. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to a number of the members over the last short while that I've been in this position to forward their causes, as well as some of the issues that I've been aware of through the Ministry of Health previously, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've looked at, in consultation with the members from that area, on a all-season road, progressing with that project in the near future, Mr. Speaker. Also with improvements to areas like Cumberland Airport, Pelican Narrows Airport, and other infrastructure projects in the north to make sure that transportation is facilitated and safe in the north.
You're here.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, Northerners deserve so much better from their government. This was a promise made, and it's a promise they've broken. People are trapped in their community when the barge stops running and the lake needs to freeze. This government has no problem spending $2 billion on a bypass in the south, but they won't build a road to Wollaston Lake. Why has this government abandoned the people in Wollaston Lake?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, we have been approached by the groups up in the Athabasca Basin about the project, and we're currently working on the 3 different phases that would be involved in that project, Mr. Speaker. The first phase involving construction of the winter road that will eliminate the need of travel on the ice road. Phase 2 would be the upgraded seasonal road, and eventually working towards the upgraded all-weather road of Phase 3, Mr. Speaker. But we know the record of this government when it comes to investment around the province, including in the north and in the south, Mr. Speaker. We know full well the member from Athabasca was previously a highways minister, and we know under this government the investments in the north have doubled when it comes to infrastructure as opposed to the members across the floor.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, it's simple. When would the good people of Wollaston Lake get their road?
You're here.
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the member across would know full well, or maybe they don't, but this is a combination effort on behalf of the federal government and the provincial government, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we look at the provincial government investment in this road. We've already got the $7.9 million invested in the first 14 kilometres, Mr. Speaker. We offered the federal government additional investment to encourage the construction of remaining parts of the road, Mr. Speaker, at least to the Phase 1 to eliminate the need for the ice road. Mr. Speaker, we're currently waiting on information and some of the agreements back from the federal government. We're willing to go above and beyond our commitment. The initial $7.9 million, again, we've built the 14 kilometres, and we're working with stakeholders, including the federal government, in the near future to make sure that they live up to their commitment as well.
Why is the member on her feet?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
What's your point of order?
Speaker, in his comments, the Minister of Environment made a comment regarding the members on this side's viewpoints on pipelines, and he said that we don't support pipelines. And Mr. Speaker, as you know, I have a number of instances on the record where this side of the House fully and completely supports pipelines in Saskatchewan. So I would call on, I think that's an unparliamentary comment, and he should apologize.
Stop doing that.
Recognize the Government House Leader.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In response to the point of order raised by the opposition House Leader, the statement made by the Minister of the Environment is in fact factual, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite stood up and voted against the Northern Gateway Pipeline as one example, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has repeatedly stated his opposition to the energy sector, standing in front of a sign called "Keep It in the Ground" when he gave one notable speech, Mr. Speaker. I'm not really sure what grounds under which the member is raising the rule, but the statement, in fact, is factual.
I'll take the point of order under advisement. Why is the member on her feet?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
What's your point of order?
In his ironic comments, the government House Leader made exactly the same allegations that the Minister of Environment has, and I have November 14th, 2019, this party, this side of the House supported all of those pipelines that they're talking about. On June 23rd, 2016, in a 75-minute debate, again, this side of the House supported them. On April 29, 2018, again, this side of the House has continually supported pipelines, and the allegations being made by the member of the Minister for the Environment and that House Leader, Mr. Speaker, are patently false.
Recognized Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see question period is continuing in points of order, so.
This Assembly is asking me to come up with a response to a point of order. Can you give me the opportunity to listen? Recognized Government House Leader.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I believe the point of order was similar to the first one, and the response would be similar as well. The fact is, and the reality is, that is a party opposite that does not support pipelines. In fact, they stood up, Mr. Speaker. They voted against pipelines. They've supported their national leader who campaigned.
Okay. Thank you. I'll take this under. Stop it. Okay, enough's enough. I'll take this under advisement, this actual point, period. Why is the member on his feet?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
What is your point of order?
The member from Athabasca shouted across for everybody in the Assembly to hear that the Government House Leader was lying. I'd ask you to review the tape. Now they're applauding this, Mr. Speaker. How can they possibly be applauding an unparliamentary language?
Bring the leader back.
Okay. I didn't hear the comment because everybody was yelling across at each other. So, stop it. Enough. Are you kidding me? I'll take it under advisement. That's it. We'll go through the tape as well. That's it. We're moving on. Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, Honourable Mr. Hargrave.
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Rule 15.2, I wish to withdraw item number 1.
We're in introduction of bills. Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm assuming that we are now on second reading speeches for the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019. If we're not, I'll take my place and wait for it to come up sometime later on in the debate.
197 intro.
Yeah, we're not there. Introduction of bills. I recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
Is it moved by the Minister that Bill number 197 be now introduced and read a first time? Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time?
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting.
Item number 2, Honourable Mr. Hargrave.
Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's moved by the Minister that Bill number 198 be now introduced, read a first time. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting.
Item number 3, Honourable Mr. Ryder.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Costs Recovery Act, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 199 be now introduced and read a first time. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Government motions. Item number 1, Honourable Mr. Moe.
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Rule 15.2, I wish to withdraw item number 1 under government motions.
Motion is withdrawn.
Second readings. Item number 1, Bill number 195, the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019. Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At long last, it's my privilege to rise today to move second reading of the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019. This bill will amend the Lobbyists Act to address recommendations made by the Registrar of Lobbyists in his annual report. The Lobbyist Act has been enforced since 2016 and provides transparency with respect to who is talking to public office holders on certain issues. The Act requires that consultant lobbyists hired to represent a particular organization or interest for a limited time and in-house lobbyists who are employees register their activities with the registrar. The names of these individuals and who they are lobbying is available to the public. Mr. Speaker, following the recommendations of the registrar, the proposed provisions will prohibit lobbyists from providing gifts or personal benefits to public office holders. Gift or personal benefit is defined to include money, if there is no obligation to repay it, and a service, hospitality, or property, including the use of property that is provided without charge or for less than its commercial value. Additional items may be prescribed in the regulations. There is a similar restriction against members receiving gifts in the Members' Conflict of Interest Act. This new provision will make it an offence under the Act for a lobbyist to provide a gift or personal benefit, except where that gift or personal benefit is part of a normal social conventions and is worth less than $200. Mr. Speaker, the proposed provisions will also remove the exception from registration for all non-profit organizations, as was recommended by the registrar. A limited exemption for registration for nonprofits will continue for nonprofit organizations with a charitable mandate and less than 5 employees who lobby for a total of less than 30 hours per year. Small charities operating through volunteers will continue not to be required to register. All nonprofits without a charitable mandate will be required to register. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the registrar recommended that the threshold for registrations be reduced to promote transparency by requiring more individuals who lobby to register. The proposed provisions will reduce the threshold for registration as an in-house lobbyist from 100 hours spent lobbying to 30 hours, which includes time spent on preparation and travel for lobbying efforts. This will ensure that the activities of more individuals are captured by the legislation without requiring registration of every casual encounter with a public office holder. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019.
It's been moved that bill number 185 now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Very much again, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to on behalf of the official opposition, to respond to Bill 196, the Lobbyist Amendment Act, Mr. Speaker. And I can say, we're making a step in the right direction as it pertains to addressing the Lobbyist Act that we have been calling for changes at or for over a number of years. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to my colleague, the member from Saskatoon Centre, who has advocated on many occasions the ethics of politicians, so to speak, in this Assembly. And of course, Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking of the member from Saskatoon Centre. And as we look at this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, my colleague led the charge in trying to do one very simple thing, and that is to provide accountability and transparency for the government and who is lobbying the government for any particular favors, who's lobbying the government for any legislative changes. He feels, as we all feel within the NDP caucus, that there ought to be more insight as to who these lobbyists are, where they're from, what they do. Now, Mr. Speaker, the member from Saskatoon Centre, I'm going to directly quote the media release that was sent out yesterday. And I think it's important for people to know exactly the intent of what we are trying to do as it pertains to the lobbyist challenges when it comes to accountability and transparency that the people of Saskatchewan should expect. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm directly quoting from the Saskatchewan NDP caucus, the media release, and I quote, "A smaller loophole isn't good enough. NDP ethics and democracy critic David Forbes says rule change insufficient." The NDP ethics and democracy critic David Forbes slammed the Sask Party government for failing to close a loophole in the Lobbyist Act and legislation that they tabled today. "A smaller loophole isn't good enough," said Forbes. "Under the new threshold, a lobbyist could meet a minister for coffee every single week for more than 6 months without anybody knowing. These amendments let Saskatchewan people down by failing to fix the holes in our outdated rule book. The Sask Party just keeps looking out for the wealthy and well-connected instead of doing what's right for the Saskatchewan people. New amendments to the Lobbying Act have lowered the threshold at which a company needs to register as a lobbyist from 100 hours to 30 hours. Forbes said the threshold should simply be eliminated so that all lobbying activity is on public record. Register